On the morning of April the 7th, 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy prepared for one of the most desperate and tragic missions in its history. The world's largest battleship, the super dreadnought Yamato, stood at the heart of this plan. She was known across the Pacific as the unsinkable giant, a steel titan built with 18-inch guns, the largest naval artillery ever mounted on a warship. To Japanese commanders, she symbolized national pride, sacrifice, and the belief that a single decisive blow could still change the course of the war. But by the spring of 1945, the situation had drastically changed. Japan was losing territory across the Pacific. American forces had already captured Iwo Jima, and now the Battle of Okinawa, just 340 miles from the Japanese mainland, was raging with unimaginable intensity for Japan's high command. The fall of Okinawa meant the fall of Japan itself. And so, the desperate Operation Tengo was born. A one-way suicide mission led by the greatest warship ever built. Yamato would sail toward Okinawa, attack the American invasion fleet, and then beach herself on the island to act as an unsinkable fortress. There would be no fuel for the return journey. Every officer and every sailor on board understood this clearly. They were not expected to survive. Yet more than 3,000 men prepared to sail, driven by loyalty, duty, and the grim acceptance of fate. Before dawn, the massive battleship shuddered as her engines awoke. She was accompanied by a small escort, light cruisers and destroyers, nowhere near strong enough to defend her against what the Americans could throw into the sky. Japan had almost no air cover left. The naval aviation that once stunned America at Pearl Harbor was all but gone. Yamato would be alone against entire waves of U.S. carrier aircraft. As she departed Tokuyama Harbor, sailors lined the decks in silence. Many had written farewell letters the night before. Some quietly sang old naval hymns. Others stared into the dark sea, knowing they would never see home again. The mission began with a heavy silence, and the weight of history seemed to rest on the Yamato's armored hull. American intelligence had already cracked Japanese communications. Fleet commanders knew Yamato was coming long before she left port. As soon as the giant battleship set sail, U.S. submarines shadowed her movements from a distance, relaying updates to Admiral Raymond Spruance's massive carrier task forces. The Americans were not going to let the world's largest battleship get anywhere near Okinawa. By mid-morning, Yamato was steaming through the East China Sea at full speed. Her massive guns, each barrel weighing as much as a locomotive, were loaded, and ready anti-aircraft crews stood at their stations, scanning the sky. The captain, Admiral Seiichi Ito, understood that the Americans would rely entirely on air power. As long as Yamato remained afloat, she posed a symbolic and psychological threat that the U.S. Navy could not tolerate. At around 10 a.m., the first American reconnaissance aircraft spotted the formation high above the clouds. A lone U.S. PBM Mariner flying boat transmitted a simple but devastating message. Enemy force located. With that signal, waves of carrier aircraft, hundreds of bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters began launching from American carriers offshore. On board Yamato, the tension grew thick. Lookouts reported increasing aircraft signals on radar. Anti-aircraft gunners tightened the straps on their helmets and wiped sweat from their palms. The sea was calm, but the air trembled with the distant noise of engines approaching from beyond the horizon. The greatest battleship ever built was about to face the ultimate test of modern air power. At approximately 12:20 p.m., the first wave of American aircraft came screaming down from the clouds. Dozens of Hellcats, Helldivers, and Avenger torpedo bombers plunged toward Yamato from all directions. The air suddenly vibrated with explosions, tracer fire, and the thunder of anti-aircraft guns. Yamato's crew responded with everything they had. Her dual-purpose guns roared, filling the sky with shells. Machine guns rattled in desperation, trying to cut down incoming bombers before they could release their payloads. Explosions erupted across the decks as bombs slammed into the massive ship. One torpedo struck her port side, sending a violent shockwave through the hull. The battleship listed slightly, but damage crews rushed to counterflood compartments to stabilize her. Yamato's armor was thick, designed to absorb punishment from enemy guns, but torpedoes beneath the waterline were a deadlier threat. Another torpedo hit the starboard side. Then a third. Yamato began to slow, her ability to turn reduced. Still, the crew fought fiercely. Anti-aircraft teams continued firing, even as smoke choked the air and fire spread across the decks. More American aircraft arrived, another wave, and then another. The sky became a storm of metal and fire. The giant battleship was being drowned, not by shells from another battleship, but by relentless attacks from above. By 1:30 p.m., Yamato was burning, listing badly, and losing speed. Yet the crew refused to abandon their guns. They kept firing, even as the sea began to rise over the edges of the deck. By early afternoon on April 7, 1945, the Yamato, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was fighting a battle she was never designed to win. American carrier pilots had unleashed a coordinated, relentless assault that came in wave after wave. The world's largest battleship was bleeding, burning, and slowing under the weight of torpedo after torpedo. Yet, deep inside the hull, her crew refused to surrender. Damage control teams fought fiercely to contain flooding, steam pressure was pushed to dangerous limits, and anti-aircraft crews stayed at their stations even as the deck grew slick with oil and seawater. Shortly after 1:40 p.m., the situation grew even more desperate. American torpedo bombers began focusing their attacks on the port side, deliberately targeting the battleship's weaker compartments. Another series of torpedoes slammed into Yamato's flank, each one tearing open steel and flooding crucial machinery rooms. The battleship's list increased sharply. First 10 degrees, then 15. The engineering crews fought to counter flood, but their options were fading. Pumps were failing. Compartments were collapsing. Fires raged across the upper decks. Inside the command tower, Admiral Ito and Captain Ariga received the latest damage reports. They understood the reality. Yamato would not reach Okinawa. The unsinkable battleship had become a burning hulk, barely able to steer, nearly dead in the water. Yet they refused to abandon the fight. Their final orders were simple: continue firing until the guns could fire no more. At 2 p.m., a massive explosion shook the forward deck as bombs struck near the main battery. The shockwave was felt throughout the ship. Crewmen were thrown off their feet. Smoke poured into the sky in thick, black columns visible from miles away. American pilots reported seeing the giant battleship engulfed in smoke, flames, and bursts of anti-aircraft fire that looked like sparks from a dying forge. Despite everything, Yamato's gunners fought on. The massive 18.1-inch guns could no longer be aimed properly. The ship's list was too great. Yet the secondary and anti-aircraft batteries kept firing desperately at the sky shell casings scattered across the deck like fallen leaves. Even when the barrels overheated, the gunners continued loading them with blistered hands. At 2:20 p.m., another concentrated torpedo attack struck the already weakened port side. This time, the damage was catastrophic. Seawater rushed into the lower decks, extinguishing boiler fires and cutting power. The ship slowed to a crawl. Alarms echoed through the interior. Emergency lighting flickered. Flooding spread uncontrollably. Captain Ariga knew the end was near. He ordered all remaining crew to stand by for final instructions. But many sailors refused to leave their stations. Some clung to the guns. Others remained in the engine rooms, waist-deep in water, trying to keep the ship alive for just a few minutes more. Their loyalty was absolute, even as the sea claimed their compartments one by one. By 2:40 p.m., the ship was listing nearly 30 degrees. Aircraft continued attacking, dropping bombs directly onto the superstructure. American planes circled overhead like hawks, finishing the kill. Pilots later recalled the sight. A Titan slowly rolling onto her side, flames consuming her decks, the vast hull groaning as steel twisted under pressure. At 2:45 p.m., the Yamato passed the point of no return. Her armored citadel began to submerge. The massive forward turrets dipped toward the sea. Sailors clung to railings as the deck tilted. Some jumped into the water, but oil fires spread quickly, burning those who surfaced. The air was filled with the sound of roaring flames, rushing water, and the fading thunder of the ship's final explosions. Then, at approximately 2:48 p.m., the unimaginable happened. A colossal internal explosion erupted beneath the waterline, likely the detonation of her forward magazines. The blast was so powerful that American pilots felt the shock wave from miles away. A mushroom-shaped cloud of smoke and fire shot thousands of feet into the sky, rising higher than any explosion yet seen in the Pacific War. The sea itself was torn apart, throwing debris, steel fragments, and fireballs into the air. In a single instant, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the greatest battleship ever built, was ripped in half. The surviving escorts watched in horror. The shockwave rocked their own ships. Flames spread across the water's surface, trapping many of the sailors who had jumped overboard. The ocean became a burning grave. By 2:50 p.m., Yamato was gone. All that remained was smoke, fire, and the floating wreckage of a dream that once symbolized Japan's naval supremacy. Out of more than 3,000 men aboard, only a few hundred survived. Admiral Ito and Captain Ariga went down with their ship, refusing rescue, choosing instead to die with their crew and with the battleship they had sworn to command. News of the sinking reached the Japanese mainland that evening. For many, it was more than the loss of a warship. It was the symbolic end of Japan's naval power, an emotional blow that echoed through the nation. The Yamato, once believed to be invincible, had been destroyed not by another battleship, but by the overwhelming air power of a modern navy. Her death marked the passing of an era. The age of battleships was over, and the age of aircraft dominance had arrived. In the years that followed, historians would look back at Operation Tengo as a tragic final gesture of defiance. A mission built on honor but doomed by reality, Yamato had sailed, knowing she would not return. She had faced overwhelming odds with unmatched courage, and she had fallen in a blaze so violent that the sky itself seemed to mourn her loss. The destruction of the Yamato remains one of the most dramatic and emotional moments in naval history. A story of sacrifice, duty, and the end of a legend.